Hello there and welcome back to another video. In today's video, I'm going to be checking out a computer that I've wanted to mess around with for a while, but that I've only recently pulled the trigger on purchasing. This is the HP Z440 Workstation computer, and a lot of you are probably familiar with this system if you've hung out in the cheap used computers world for long enough. This system, being a dedicated workstation PC, runs Intel Xeon processors. More specifically, it runs Intel E5-1600 and 2600 series V3 and V4 chips. I managed to score a pretty sweet deal on my Z440, as I only paid about $130 for it all in, and considering the specs packed in this system, that was a great price. So let's go over this system specs while exploring its construction and features. This system has 64GB of DDR4 2133MHz ECC RAM in it, which on its own could seemingly go for about $50 to $60. I got this RAM in a 4x16GB kit, but even with 4 sticks of RAM, I still have room to upgrade. This is because, being a workstation system that runs these Xeon chips, the HP Z440 supports quad-channel memory, meaning that there are 8 total RAM slots available. For memory-intensive workloads, this expandability, maximum capacity, and bandwidth could be incredibly useful, especially for the prices that you can get this for. This PC also came with an NVIDIA Quadro K600, which really isn't very special at all, but it's definitely nice to have, particularly when considering that these systems run chips that don't have integrated graphics on them. That's right, since these run Xeons and not the more desktop-ish Xeons that sometimes have iGPUs and share sockets with other desktop chips from their generation, there aren't any integrated graphics in these chips, so make sure you have a GPU of some sort to get a display output. Before I move on to the rest of this system specs, I'm going to check and maybe replace the CMOS battery, since it's right here next to the GPU. This is always a good idea to do on systems like these, as these batteries are often starting to run flat, just like this one was. With the CMOS battery replaced and this minor side quest completed now, let's go back to exploring the rest of the system. Another thing I like about this system that I got is that it comes with an SSD. Considering that SSD prices have been going up, I can always appreciate getting an SSD included with one of these computers. This time is no exception, especially because this computer came with a Samsung 840 EVO 500GB SATA SSD, not a bad drive at all. Plus, it came in this interesting little 2.5-inch to 3.5-inch adapter sled thing. I'm not sure if this is an official HP part or if it's just something the previous owner used to put this SSD in, but either way, I like it and I think it's pretty cool. So far, everything about this system is looking great, and the keen-eyed among you might have even noticed that the power supply and motherboard look like they might be standard ATX components. Well, this is where the two most disappointing aspects of this system lie, as neither of these components are standard. The motherboard is mostly standard, as far as I can tell. The dimensions and the mounting holes on the motherboard match up with those of an ATX board, but there are a few differences. The front I/O is proprietary, though that's hardly a rare thing in OEM systems, but the real killer is that the power connectors it uses aren't standard. The motherboard connector looks pretty normal at first glance, but instead of being a 24-pin connector, it's actually a proprietary 18-pin one. The CPU connector is also a 12-pin connector, so that's not standard either. The fact that neither the motherboard nor the power supply is standard are this system's only real letdowns in my opinion. Though, unlike in many other OEM systems with proprietary power supplies, with the power supply in this system, it is possible to get one with PCI Express connectors on it. There are 2 power supplies that HP makes for the Z440, a 525-watt one and a 700-watt one. The 700-watt unit can be found for about $25 on eBay here in the US, and that unit has 2 6-pin PCI Express connectors on it, meaning that you can put some proper GPUs in here without any crazy adapters. You might have to adapt the 6-pin connector to an 8-pin connector, but I'd personally consider that to be a far more reasonable adaptation compared to a SATA to 8-pin fire hazard. Sadly, my workstation came with the 525-watt power supply, which is the only thing spec-wise I'm not too happy about with the system I got. The final thing I want to talk about on this system before I start testing its performance is the expandability of it, which is certainly an advantage of a workstation computer over a regular desktop PC. This system has 5 PCI Express slots and 1 PCI slot. There's one PCI Express Gen 2x1 slot, then a PCIe Gen 3x16 slot, a Gen 2x4 slot, a Gen 3x8 slot, and a Gen 3x16 slot again, and of course the PCI slot. All of these slots are wired to their physical maximum number of lanes though. Some desktop systems will have a physical X16 slot that only has 4 lanes wired to it. But this workstation does none of that. This thing has a ton of lanes, meaning you could put a ton of expansion cards in here. Now for the tests I'll be running today, I'm going to want a little more graphical power than the K600 will provide. I've had these cards before, and these days they're pretty weak for graphical computing. So I'm going to put my 3050 6GB into the system, and before you write a comment, I know that this is not the card of choice for a system like this. The reason I'm using this card is because it's the only extra GPU I have on hand, and I'm not going to buy another one just because this card isn't the perfect choice for properly building out this system. For now, just pretend I have the 700 watt power supply and I'm using something like a used GTX 1060. So now let's see what this system with its E5-1620 V3 and 64 gigs of RAM with an RTX 3050 can do. After booting the system up, I got several errors, all of which were caused by my replacing of the CMOS battery, and after moving past those screens, I entered the BIOS to ensure that all of our RAM was accounted for and that we did have the E5-1620 V3 that this workstation is supposed to have. The system recognized all 64 gigabytes of RAM and it was running at its correct speed, plus the correct Xeon was also installed. After booting into a Windows 10 install USB, I started navigating through the menus to install Windows on the included Samsung drive. However, the drive wasn't showing up in the Windows installer. This wasn't too surprising to me though. As being a workstation system, it's not rare for the drives to be connected to an onboard RAID controller of some sort. So I went into the system's BIOS to find the SATA settings and see if I could fix this issue through them, because it's possible that it was set to a RAID mode and setting it to something like AHCI would fix it. In the BIOS, I found that the SATA controller mode was, in fact, set to RAID. I changed it to AHCI and tried booting back into the Windows 10 installer. Still, however, the SSD did not show up as a place where I could install Windows. So I went back into the BIOS and tried one more thing, changing the SATA mode to IDE. This can lead to much poorer SATA performance, but it does seem to be possible to install Windows on a SATA drive in IDE mode, and then to go back and change it to AHCI, though you do need to do some fiddling in the registry first. In any case, I was just trying to get around downloading the drivers and loading them onto the Windows installer, but setting the SATA mode to IDE didn't make the drive show up. So I went back and set the mode back to AHCI, as that mode is ideal. Then, on another system, I downloaded and extracted the Z440 storage driver, and then I copied it to a USB stick. At the storage device selection menu in the Windows installer, I selected the load driver option and saw that 2 different drivers popped up from my USB with the extracted driver files on it. One of them seemed to be an AHCI driver, and the other seemed to be a RAID driver. I figured that since my SATA mode was AHCI, I'd try the AHCI driver first, but sadly that one didn't work. Instead, it was the RAID driver that worked, so when installing Windows on a Z440, make sure your SATA mode is set where you want it and that you install the RAID driver during the Windows install process. With Windows finally installed, I set up the installation with drivers, updates, and a couple of programs so that I could begin testing. The first tests that I ran on the system were some synthetic benchmarks, those being Cinebench R23 and 3D Mark. In Cinebench R23 Multicore, the Z440 with the Xeon E5-1620 V3, which is a 4-core 8-thread CPU from the older of the 2 generations that are supported, just for reference, scored 3961 points. In single core, the system scored 833 points. This really isn't that exceptional of a performance, but then again, this is one of the lowest end CPUs you can get for this socket, so it's really only up from here. Moving into 3D Mark, the system scored a CPU score of 3810 with a GPU score of 4812 and an overall score of 4629. I'm mainly looking at the CPU score here, as the GPU score and a significant portion of the overall score are more so reflective of the 3050, which is not what I'm trying to test today. Next up, I tested DaVinci Resolve on this system, as I think that this system might be an incredible value for someone trying to do some video editing on a budget. I tested the system in a 4K 30fps timeline with some 4K 30fps footage from my camera that's encoded in H.264 at a bitrate of approximately 120 megabits per second. Okay, let me interject for a second here. This footage is actually 29.97 FPS, but I'll be referring to it as 30 FPS because it's very close to a full 30, and 29.97 is annoying to say over and over. This is a nearly identical workload to what I hit my main editing system with when editing this videos. So today, I'm actually going to learn if my 12900K and ARC A750 workstation computer was worth it compared to a used Z440. When working with this footage on this timeline, with no proxies, just straight 4K footage, the system wasn't doing the best. Skipping through the timeline wasn't terribly responsive, and playing back footage from the timeline was not 100% smooth, especially after just skipping to a section on the timeline. Sometimes it got a bit of a groove going and could play back a long section stutter-free, but not always. I threw several random transitions between the clips and watched a fair bit of the video on the timeline without any optimized media. During this playback test, the system ended up performing okay overall. There were stutters, but it generally caught up and smoothed out the playback quite quickly after letting it sit and think for a while. Generating optimized media for this approximately 4.5 minute long timeline of video clips took a little over 8 minutes to do. Creating this media for these clips made scrubbing through them, clicking through them, and playing them back buttery smooth. Though to generate this media, it takes a while, especially with a longer timeline and/or clips, and generating it also uses a lot of storage. Exporting a 10-minute long test video using the same input footage in H.265 at 4K 30 FPS took 9 minutes and 29 seconds. However, this H.265 export puts most of the export load on the GPU, so take this metric with a bit of a grain of salt, as if you use a different GPU than I'm using, this export time will be heavily affected. Exporting an H.264, however, which seems to fall pretty much entirely on the CPU, took 52 minutes and 47 seconds for the exact same 10-minute timeline. Overall, in DaVinci Resolve, with this system and this CPU, the experience wasn't what I'd describe as ideal. However, video editing was certainly doable, and I've had systems do far, far worse than this. Meaning that I'd give this system, with its current really cheap and low power CPU, a 5 out of 10, with a 1-point reduction for the extremely long H.264 export time. Now, let's move on to checking out just a few gaming benchmarks. I did these gaming benchmarks differently than I do most of my gaming benchmarks because I'm mainly trying to see what the CPU in this system is capable of. I've already done a video featuring the 3056 gig that demonstrates how that GPU performs in gaming, so if that's what you're here to see, check out that video instead. What I've done today as my best means of testing these CPUs is lower all the settings in the games I'm testing to their lowest. This will allow the 3050 to push more frames and therefore shift some more load onto the CPU to run the simulations faster and to feed the GPU frame data faster. I've also scratched all ray tracing benchmarks today as they're completely irrelevant for today's testing goal. I've chosen 3 games to test on this system: Satisfactory, Forza Horizon 5, and Halo Infinite. I chose Satisfactory because when you have a relatively built-out factory, like my test world is, it puts much more of a strain on the CPU to run that simulation. So let's take a look at the Satisfactory results. In Satisfactory, at 1080p with low settings, the system managed an average frame rate of 109.5 FPS, with a 1% low of 53.3 and a 0.1% low of 0.5. Satisfactory is a stuttery game by nature, so I disregard the percentile lows for this benchmark. Based on the indicated CPU and GPU utilization numbers, it seems that the E5-1620 V3 CPU is the bottleneck in this game. Although this is the case, this CPU is still able to feed a decent number of frames to the GPU, which is nice to see. I would consider the experience in Satisfactory with this system more than playable. The next game that I chose, Forza Horizon 5, was chosen because it's a pretty decent example of a modern game overall, and the inbuilt benchmark gives some convenient insight into the system's performance beyond basic, average, and percentile low FPS numbers. The CPU was able to drive this 3050 pretty hard in this game, as you can see based on the utilization percentage of the GPU. It's not quite pinned at 99%, but up in the high 80s to low 90s most of the time. The system was able to output an average frame rate of 124.6 FPS at 1080p low settings, with a 1% low of 86.5 and a 0.1% low of 64.4. So far, this Z440, even with its lower end chip, is proving to be a pretty capable gaming PC. One last thing, when looking at the end screen of the Forza Horizon 5 benchmark, we can further see that this 1620 V3 can push quite a few frames, though not quite enough to pin out the 3050 at 1080p low. Lastly, let's check out Halo Infinite. I chose this game because I found that this game tends to put a surprising amount of load on a system's CPU, more than most other games like it seem to. However, interestingly, the GPU was actually the bottleneck in this game with the 1620 V3. So I guess this benchmark didn't really do what I hoped it would, which is stress out the CPU a lot. But I'll still provide the performance metrics because I might as well. At 1080p low, the system averaged a frame rate of 99.2 FPS with a 1% and 0.1% low of 77.5 and 59.8 FPS respectively. These gaming benchmarks show that even though the Z440 was created as a workstation computer, it's more than capable of making a solid budget gaming PC. Keep in mind that these results were with a 1620 V3, a very low-end chip, and I imagine with a chip such as a 1650 V4, we could get a much better gaming experience. In fact, thinking about this while writing this script got me so interested in how a 1650 V4 could perform in games that I actually went out and bought one, and I'll be testing it later in this video. I was originally only going to do the 1620 V3 and a 2697 V4, but I've decided to add that at the end of the video, so stick around if that's something that intrigues you. But back to the originally planned tests, let's swap in the 2697 V4, which is an 18-core, 36-thread chip from the newer of the two supported generations, and let's run all the same tests to see how it compares. Starting with the two synthetic benchmarks, in Cinebench R23, the Z440 with a 2697 V4 scored a multi-core score of 14,876. This score is several times better than the 1620 V3 score, though I'd say that's not too surprising, considering that the 2697 V4 has 18 cores compared to the 1620's 4. In single core, the 2697 V4 slightly beat the 1620 V3 with a score of 860 compared to the previous chip's 833. The fact that the single core improvement is pretty small isn't too surprising though, because the 2697 V4 is certainly more of a core count focused chip as compared to a single core boost focused chip. I'll be interested to see how a chip with a higher single core boost will perform in comparison to these two chips. In 3D Mark, the system scored a CPU score of 9,849, far better than the previous 3,810. The GPU score stayed about the same at 4,810 points, but that's not very surprising. The major uplift in the CPU score made the overall score of the system increase significantly, going from 4629 to 5209, but again, the CPU score is the most relevant result here. Now let's jump back into the gaming tests with this new CPU to see how much we've improved, or if we've improved at all. The single core performance is very similar across these two chips, so it will be interesting to see if my selected games benefit much from having more than 4 cores. Starting with satisfactory again, at 1080p low settings to push the CPU as hard as possible, we saw an average frame rate of 137.9 FPS with a 1% low of 65 and a 0.1% low of 0.4. Again, the lows in this test are pretty irrelevant due to the nature of satisfactory as a stuttery game. However, the average frame rate is very interesting here, as we gained a whole 28.4 frames per second on the old CPU's result. Our GPU still doesn't seem to be fully pinned out when pushing this many frames, so I believe that in this game, the full performance difference between the two chips is being shown and isn't being capped by a pinned out GPU. I will say that this result doesn't surprise me very much, as satisfactory, in a somewhat built out world like this one, does have a lot of simulation processing for the CPU to do, and having more cores to compute this on should improve the overall performance. Next, in Forza Horizon 5 at 1080p low, I observed that our CPU was still the bottleneck, which is good to see for comparing the two CPUs' performances. Interestingly, we actually lost some performance in the average frame rate with this new CPU. The average frame rate dropped from 124.6 FPS to 113.1 with the new CPU. A large enough difference, I'm not sure it can be called margin of error. Plus, it persisted even after retesting this benchmark. Exactly the reason for this? I can't say. However, it is certainly an interesting behavior. The percentile lows in the test were 66.5 FPS as the 1% low and 3.2 as the 0.1% low, by the way. The inbuilt benchmarks results for this test showed that our CPU simulation average FPS went up significantly, though the CPU render average frame rate was lower than it was with the old chip, by a similar amount to the difference between the two benchmarked average frame rates. Finally, let's look at Halo Infinite. Once again at 1080p low, and I'm not expecting too much of a difference here due to the fact that our GPU was the bottleneck even with the old chip. As expected, there was practically zero difference between the two CPUs in the average frame rates. The average frame rate with the new chip was 100.1 FPS, a 0.9 FPS difference from the previously measured 99.2 frames per second average. Something that's absolutely within the margin of error. The 1% low was 83.7 FPS, and the 0.1% low was 74 FPS. Although in general, across these three games, the 2697 V4 wasn't world-shatteringly faster than the 1620 V3, it's still a chip that's more than capable of gaming, and a CPU that certain games will appreciate having available to them. I wouldn't recommend going out and spending $50 on a 2697 V4 if all you're doing with your Z440 is gaming though, as there are other chips that are cheaper and perform similarly. Plus, there are likely chips that perform better than the 2697 V4 while also being cheaper, one of which I already said I'll be testing later. But before I go on to that, there's one test for the 2697 V4 that I haven't talked about yet, and that's DaVinci Resolve. I've saved DaVinci Resolve for last because I believe it to be this CPU's strongest performance, due to its massive core count. I'm very happy to say that I wasn't wrong at all, as this CPU is a very capable video editing chip. I'll be testing this chip in the same way with the same footage as I did the 1620 V3. That is 4K footage on a 4K 30fps timeline, which is technically 29.97, encoded in H.264 at about 120 megabit per second. When cutting up a piece of footage on the timeline, the system was handling it great. Clicking through the footage was really quite responsive, not massively less responsive than it is on my main editing workstation with an i9 12900K. Playing the footage back on the timeline as I was going through and editing out parts of it was no problem at all for this system. There was still an occasional stutter or two, but nothing like what we saw with the 1620 V3. When putting some transitions on the footage and playing it back, there were just a few more slowdowns and stuttery sections, mostly around the transitions, but nothing that would make this system unusable for editing, and this thing is still well outperforming the 1620 V3. Generating optimized media for this 5-minute, 8-second long timeline of clips took a mere 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Remember, the 1620 V3 only had to do a 4.5 minute long timeline, and that chip took nearly thrice as long as this one did to process an even longer timeline. This is a massive improvement. Just as with the old CPU, optimized media made scrubbing through the clips and playing things back very smooth, but that should be no surprise. Finally, let's talk rendering. As before, I'll be testing exporting an MP4 in both H.264 and H.265. Both exports will be done at 4K 29.97 FPS. Also remember that the H.265 export falls pretty much entirely on the GPU, so I'm not expecting too much of a difference between the two CPUs in that test. Exporting the exact same project file as was used on the 1620 V3's tests in H.265 with the aforementioned settings took 9 minutes and 44 seconds, about the same time as with the 1620 V3. To export this timeline at H.264 though, which falls on the CPU for encoding, the computer took 20 minutes and 40 seconds. That's less than half of what the old CPU took to export that same video in H.264, which is a wildly massive improvement. It is a shame that DaVinci seemed to be incapable of using 100% of our CPU, and my best guess as to why that is that exporting at H.264 might not be the most multi-threaded task, but in any case, it's still a massive improvement in comparison to the 1620. And that's all the testing of the 2697 V4 completed. Overall, I think that this chip is an absolutely amazing chip in 2024. Plus, for being available for a mere $50 used, this thing just punches hard. If you're looking for a budget video editing system, or a system for some other kind of workstation task that benefits largely from high CPU compute, a Z440 with a 2697 V4 is an amazing choice. Even though this chip really isn't the smartest choice for gaming, it's still more than capable of playing games at high frame rates if you do that in your free time. However, if all you're doing with your Z440 is playing games, as this is a great chassis to build a budget gaming PC in, the next CPU that I'm going to test might be a better option for you. The Xeon E5-1650 V4 is a 6-core, 12-thread chip from the newer of the Z440's 2 supported generations with a boost clock of 4 GHz, indicating that it should hopefully have some decent single-core performance. I tested this chip in the 2 synthetic benchmarks as well as in all 3 games, but have skipped DaVinci Resolve on this one because those tests take a really long time to do, and you've already basically seen the 2 ends of the spectrum for available DaVinci Resolve performance with this computer. This chip lands in between the previously tested chips, closer to the 1620, and based on that, you can have a rough idea on how it should perform. Plus, if you're going to be doing enough video editing for the performance to really matter, just buy a 2697 V4, it will shred video editing and do pretty solidly in games too. But now, let's move on to testing the final chip I bought for the video. In Cinebench R23 multicore, the 1650 V4 scored 6219 points, and in single core, it scored 857, marginally below the score of the 2697 V4. Notably, I didn't see the CPU turboing up to 4 GHz ever during the single core test, which it theoretically should be doing in a single core workload such as this. I went off on a small tangent and messed around in the BIOS a bit to see if there was a setting I needed to change, and honestly I was kind of hoping there wasn't a setting I needed to change because that means I would have had to retest the other 2 chips. However, I was unable to get the single core boost past about 3.5 GHz, so I'm wondering if this is some kind of limitation with the Z440's motherboard. If you know why this is and if it's possible to fix it, let me know in the comments. In any case, the Cinebench score puts it squarely ahead of the 1620 V3, especially in multicore, and about equivalent to the 2697 V4 in terms of single core. In 3D Mark, the 1650 V4 scored a CPU score of 6081, a GPU score of 4808, and an overall score of 4963. I would like to note just how much better 3D Mark rated this CPU than it did the 1620 V3 in the CPU test. For only having 2 more cores and a bit more single core performance, I didn't really expect 3D Mark to rate the 1650 V4 a whole 2,271 points better than the 1620 V3. That's about a 37% improvement in the CPU score, which is pretty massive. Now let's move on to the actual gaming tests with this chip. Starting out with satisfactory, the 1650 V4 did quite well. However, interestingly, it actually dropped in performance in comparison to the 2697, likely due to the nature of this game and its deep-rooted desire for CPU compute. The average frame rate in satisfactory, with the same settings as the previous benchmarks of course, was 124.3 FPS. The irrelevant to this game percentile lows were 71.7 FPS and 0.6 FPS as the 1% and 0.1% lows. This is a very solid performance, especially for a $15 CPU, though it did drop 13.6 frames in comparison to the 2697. Of course, even though it didn't quite beat out the big boy CPU, it still shredded the 1620 V3, gaining 14.8 FPS on its 109.5 FPS average. Now let's move on to Forza Horizon 5, a game where I think the performance uplift of this CPU will be most noticeable. This is because in Forza, the 2697 V4 didn't get along nicely with the game, and the 1620 V3 just wasn't able to pin out the GPU all the time, meaning it was limiting the performance. In Forza Horizon 5, the average frame rate at 1080p lowest with the 1650 V4 was 138.6 FPS, with a 1% low of 99.4 FPS, and a 0.1% low of 82. This was a great performance in this game, not only because the frame rate was high, but also because the CPU was able to pin out the GPU for the majority of the time the game was running. During the few times where the GPU wasn't stuck at close to 99% usage, it was still working pretty hard, remaining in the high 80s to low 90s in terms of usage. Finally, let's end on the failed benchmark, Halo Infinite. Again, this one didn't work like I hoped it would, but I'm still including the numbers because I have the data, so I might as well pass it on to you. In Halo Infinite, this system with the 1650 V4 managed a 99.8 FPS on average at 1080p low. The 1% low was 85.4 FPS, and the 0.1% low was 1.4. And that wraps up the benchmarks for this video. Now let's take a look at the system as a whole and the 3 chips that were tested today to see what this Z440 really has to offer. Firstly, let's talk about the obvious advantages. The first major advantage being the fact that this is a full-size tower with the option to get a high wattage PSU with PCI Express power. This means that this chassis immediately beats out an old Optiplex for making a budget gaming PC. Not having to use janky adapters to power a graphics card and being able to actually fit a sizable GPU in here are major benefits. Plus, the CPU options for this system, while being Xeons, are more than good enough to play games still. For a video editing workstation, or a workstation for some other tasks that like a lot of CPU and RAM, I think that this is one of the best, if not the best systems you can get for this task at this price. Being able to pack 18 cores, 36 threads, and 64 gigs of RAM into a system for less than $200 is incredible. Though do note that I was only able to do this good because of the good deal I got on my system, but these kinds of offers pop up often enough on eBay for repeating this to be doable without waiting for months. Finally, let's conclude the performance on the CPUs, as the data doesn't really paint as clear a picture as I would have liked it to. The 1620 V3 is a solid 4-core 8-thread chip that's super inexpensive. It did okay in the multi-core tests and also okay in the single-core tests. When playing games with this chip, it was a bottleneck most of the time for the RTX 3056 gig that I was using to test it. However, I was playing everything at 1080p low. The 1620 seemed to be able to consistently push a little bit above 100 FPS on average in the gaming tests, making it a perfectly sufficient gaming chip. However, when it comes to workstation tasks, such as video editing, the chip began to fall short. Video editing with this chip was doable, but it wasn't a very responsive experience, and it did struggle at times. In addition to this, exporting anything in H.264 will take forever with this CPU. Moving on to the 2697 V4, this chip, being one of the most performant chips for this socket, did great. In the synthetic benchmarks, it beat out the 1620 V3 in single core and absolutely demolished it in multi-core. In games, this chip beat out the 1620 V3 massively in Satisfactory, tied it in Halo Infinite due to the GPU being a bottleneck, but lost to it in Forza Horizon 5. The Forza Horizon 5 performance is still a little mysterious to me, and I'm just going to have to guess that it's something with Forza Horizon 5's optimization working weirdly with 18 cores. With this chip, the system still offered a decent performance in Horizon 5, just not quite as good a performance as the 1620 V3 did. When it came time to test video editing on the 2697 V4, this chip ran away with the lead. All of its cores, as well as its slightly better single-core performance, provided a very smooth editing experience. It wasn't 100% smooth all of the time with my editing workload. However, it was so much better than the 1620 V3 was. Exporting in H.264 was still a lengthy process, but it took far less than half as long as the 1620 V3 did to do the same thing. And working on the timeline was a perfectly usable experience with this chip. I would say that the 2697 V4 is a great chip for video editing. Finally, the 1650 V4 lands in between the two previously mentioned chips, while certainly leaning more towards the 1620. In the synthetic benchmarks, this chip showed a pretty large uplift over the 1620 V3 in multi-core performance, and a small but noteworthy uplift in single-core. In gaming, the 1650 V4 didn't quite beat out the 2697 in Satisfactory, however, it certainly beat the 1620. In Forza Horizon 5, this chip was able to pump out a massive amount of frames, taking the lead from the 1620 V3 by a pretty large margin. As with the other chips, in Halo Infinite, the GPU was the bottleneck, and it demonstrated similar performance levels to other chips in this test because of that. In conclusion, I think that if you're going to be buying a Z440 for a gaming PC, something on the level of the 1650 V4 is a decent sweet spot to be in for gaming performance. Sure, a few games might prefer the 2697, as we saw with Satisfactory, but at the same time, the 2697 costs $50, while the 1650 costs about $15. Plus, it significantly outperformed the 2697 in Horizon 5 meaning that I believe the 1650 V4 is one of the better options for gaming on this system. However, if you're going to be doing video editing with one of these machines, the 2697 V4 is undoubtedly the champion of that task. And lastly, for the 1620 V3, if it's all you can afford at the moment with your Z440, it's still a solid chip that provides a usable performance in gaming as well as video editing. However, it will take better to lighter footage when video editing, meaning it might not be quite sufficient for 4K editing like what I do. Well, that's all that I have for you today. I hope that you were able to at least enjoy this video and maybe even learn a thing or two. In any case, I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.